Okay, so now we're going to solve question 45 and 46 from the SAT Minutes 9 reading section. And these are paired questions, so that means we get the first question here, and we got to choose the evidence here, so we'll solve these ones together. 45 says, it can reasonably be inferred from the passage that Martone's research interest in lignin should be considered. So basically this question is asking about what do we know about Martone's research and interest, and what can we say about it. And then we're given our text, 46, A, B, C, and D, and then we got to choose the text that will match it. Before we solve this one, there's two rules in general that I follow that I don't have great names for yet, but I'm still developing the names, and we want to use them to solve this. So the first one is what I'm calling the linear pacing rule. Linear pacing rule. Very basic common sense, which basically says the SAT follows a very general line from point A to point B, meaning they just reference things, they refer to things in sequential order. What does that mean for us? It means that if we're dealing with Martone, right, and his research interests, we should only be looking really after the first mention of Martone, which is, make sure I'm right, which is right here in line 21. That means that any text that comes before here, it could, in theory, mention Martone, right? Maybe just his name is brought up here, but he's referred to up here. Generally, SAT doesn't work like that. It's going to mention the person, then it's going to refer to them. So already, it's unlikely to be one of the texts before line 21. The second thing is what I call the question pacing rule, which essentially means the order of the questions usually matches the order of text. So if you have a question that refers to one part of the text, the question after that will probably refer to the text that comes after the one just mentioned, right? So in this case, for our question, the one before it, line 44, which you don't have here, but basically it references lines 11, which over here references this text. Strong evidence for lignin and a red algae. So that means it's probably unlikely to be a text that comes before this point. So those two rules can help us to sort of guide our search for the text. Again, we need to do our due diligence. There's exceptions at every point on this test, but that should help us to sort of weight our options and start off on the right foot. Let's go through the options. Again, looking for a text that's going to tell us about Martone's research interest. So first we can look at 7 and 9. 7 and 9 says, lignin production for those tasks was considered a key adaptive advantage of vascular plants which descend from green algae. So first and foremost, nothing to do with Martone, nothing to do with his research interest. Two, it violates the two rules that we just mentioned. It comes before the text that the previous question mentioned, and it comes before the mention of Martone in general. So feel pretty confident to get rid of this one. 13 to 16 says, the findings suggest that a biological building block fundamental to the success of land plants is lignin, has roots that stretch out far deeper and maybe wider to evolutionary time than was known. This is like the one before it. Nothing about Martone, nothing about his research interests. It comes after this text here, but before the first mention of him. So I feel pretty strongly we can eliminate this option as well. 23, 26 says, the biomechanist simply wanted to better understand the toughness of this algae, I'm not going to say it, or attempt to say it, which dwells in the harsh habitat of intertidal zones along rocky shores. And another rule that I'm going to invoke here is what I call the pronoun rule. Anytime you get something that's mentioned like the biomechanist or it or they, any sort of pronoun or reference, make sure you understand who's being talked about. In this case, it's Martone. He's the biomechanist. So the way I think about it is if we have to step outside of our text to find out who's being talked about, then whatever text we use to figure that out can also be incorporated. So that means that this sentence here, we can also look at Martone didn't set out to locate lignin and algae. So basically this whole thing tells us that at first he wasn't looking for lignin and algae. He just wanted to understand the toughness of it, and then he made his finding. So this tells us very clear information about Martone and his research interests. It tells us it comes after the first mention of him, and it comes after this text here. I'd say keep it. It's definitely a strong candidate. 59 through 61 says, the puzzling thing is that it's also present lignin in calcified portions of the algae. We don't know what it's doing there, Martone says. So this comes well after um, both of these references here, the first mention of Martone, as well as the fact, as well as the evidence from the previous question. Um, but honestly, it kind of comes too far. So the question order rule means runs in both directions, meaning you want to choose a text that's not before the last text that was mentioned and not way too much farther after. Again, there's exceptions, but we should be skeptical of it. And the main thing here is that it tells us about his finding and it tells us about a question he's asking, but it doesn't really dive into his research interest, especially when compared to the last one we looked at, which is very directly about his research interest. So I think we can be confident eliminating that and choosing C as our answer for 46. So again, let's go back, just make sure we know what's being talked about here. Um, it says that the biomechanist simply wanted to better understand the toughness of the algae. He wasn't trying to look for lignin. He was just trying to look at the toughness of it, and then he happened to figure out that this has lignin. So we want an answer choice that reflects that. A says unusually insightful because it has fundamentally changed the way lignin is understood. This right here, we should recognize is a very loud claim. It has a strong burden of proof. Unusually insightful, we need strong evidence for it. It's possible to say that his finding had a big impact on the field, right? It basically says here that the finding tells us that lignin, this biological building block, has deeper evolutionary roots than we thought before. So that is a change in the science. But we can look through the rest of the text, and it's just not enough evidence to say it was unusually insightful and that it fundamentally changed the way lignin is understood. Not really true. I might have understood its evolution or changed the way we understand its evolution, but not fundamentally changed it. Too strong. We can get rid of it. B says somewhat questionable because Martone based his conclusions on an atypical sample. This would mean he did his studies and he was using weird evidence for it. There's two reasons we should be skeptical of this one. Is one, the passage is going to be sympathetic to Martone. It's going to be sympathetic to the research that it's doing. It's not going to be analyzing or spending all this time on junk science unless it's explicitly saying it's junk science. So it would be weird that Martone it would be questionable. It's just not very likely. And there's no evidence that it was an atypical sample. Let's get rid of it. C says properly cautious because Martone checked his findings about this is general. There's nothing too interesting about it. It could be true, except that there's no evidence that he checked his findings multiple times. And really, in the past, and especially C, which is the one we chose, so eliminate that. D says initially secondary because it was undertaken. And this is really perfectly matches the text we chose. Initially secondary because at first he wasn't looking for lignin. Instead, he was trying to answer particular questions about it, which refers to the toughness he was trying to understand. So we can choose answer choice D for 45 and answer choice C for 46.